Most of the time, when we form a judgment, it feels as though reasoning has occurred. Even when a conclusion arrives quickly, there's an assumption that somewhere beneath the surface, analysis has taken place. The speed doesn't disturb us because the result feels coherent. Daniel Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow, suggests that this confidence may be misplaced. Not because we're incapable of reasoning, and not because we're irrational, but because much of what feels like deliberate thought is generated automatically by processes we don't control and rarely notice. The intuitive belief is that thinking is something that we do intentionally. We weigh evidence, consider alternatives, and then arrive at conclusions. That belief feels reasonable because the final judgment appears orderly and self-authored. But what if the orderliness comes first and the sense of authorship follows? Kahneman's central distinction between two systems of thought begins here. One operates quickly, effortlessly, and continuously. The other is slower, more effortful, and more limited. The unsettling implication is not simply that the fast system exists, but that it's responsible for far more of our mental life than we assume. You don't choose to recognize a tone as threatening. You don't choose which interpretation of a sentence feels more plausible. And you don't decide whether explanations sound coherent. These impressions arise, and only after does the slower system sometimes step in, often not to reconstruct them, but to endorse them. Understanding this architecture requires setting aside the assumption that conscious reasoning is always in control. Before we can evaluate confidence, risk, bias, we have to see how judgment is formed in the first place. And that structure is less deliberate than it appears. Lesson 1 begins with a distinction that seems simple at first, but the more you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. The book asks us to picture two systems within the mind, not as literal structures in the brain or as competing personalities, but as useful descriptions of two fundamentally different modes of thinking. The first system works automatically and quick. It detects patterns, generates impressions, recognizes faces, completes sentences, anticipates movements, and produces feelings, all without effort and, most importantly, without a sense of voluntary control. Examples of this could be when you see a person's expression and immediately know when they're angry, or when you read a simple sentence and grasp its meaning without pausing, or when you instinctively brake because the car ahead of you slows down. That's the fast system at work. The second system engages when you multiply numbers in your head, when we compare complex arguments, or when we fill out tax forms. It requires attention and it takes effort. You're aware of using it because it consumes mental energy. So if someone asks you to calculate 14 times 24, you're going to feel the shift. Attention narrows, distractions fade, and your thinking becomes sequential and controlled. That shift is the slower system taking over. At first, it's tempting to frame this distinction as intuitive versus rational, or automatic versus intelligent. But Kahneman resists that oversimplification. The fast system is not foolish. In fact, it's extraordinarily sophisticated. It contains much of our world knowledge, and it learns through experience and becomes highly skilled in stable environments. A chess master seeing a board doesn't calculate every possibility. They recognize patterns instantly, and that recognition can be remarkably accurate. The fast system can be expert when the environment provides regular feedback and consistent structure. The problem isn't that system 1 is incompetent. The problem is that it operates continuously even when the situation doesn't justify confidence. So system 2, the solar system, has the ability to monitor and, if necessary, override these automatic impressions. But it's limited, attention is finite, and the effort is costly. Because engaging the slower system feels like work, and the mind tends to conserve energy whenever possible. Kahneman refers to this as the law of least effort, the tendency for the mind to default to the easiest possible mode of processing. If a judgment can be made automatically, it usually will be. What's striking is that this is where this distinction becomes more than just a classification. that System 2 often doesn't generate judgments from scratch. Instead, it endorses what System 1 has already produced. The fast system offers an answer, and unless there's a clear reason to doubt it, the slower system signs off. The result is that many of our beliefs feel deliberate even when their origins were automatic. That's the structure: an automatic system generating impressions, and a slower system that sometimes intervenes but often approves. Understanding this division is crucial because everything that follows in the book, from biases to overconfidence to misjudgments of risk, can be traced back to the interactions between these two systems. If we don't see that most impressions arise automatically, we'll assume that our conclusions are the product of careful reasoning. And if we assume that, we'll rarely think to question them. From that point, it's to understand what makes those automatic impressions feel convincing in the first place. Because if the fast system is constantly generating answers, something must determine which answers feel right. Lesson 2 starts with a question that's almost unavoidable. Why do some of these impressions feel more convincing than others? Kahneman's answer begins with something we usually overlook because it feels so ordinary: the difference between ease and strength. When processing information feels easy, the mind interprets that ease as a signal. Words that are clear and legible feel more credible than words in a difficult font. Statements we've heard before feel more likely to be true than statements we're encountering for the first time. Rhyming aphorisms sound wiser than equivalent non-rhyming ones. Even something as simple as high contrast on a screen can increase agreement. What's happening in each of these cases is not an evaluation of evidence, it's a response to fluency. When something is processed smoothly, System 1 generates a feeling of familiarity. And that familiarity blends into confidence because the experience of ease is pleasant and doesn't trigger alertness. The slower system remains relatively inactive since there's no signal to engage scrutiny. On the other hand, when processing feels strained, the mind shifts into a more vigilant mode. Cognitive strain activates System 2. Attention increases, doubt rises, and we become more careful. The important realization here is that the feeling of truth isn't always tied to the strength of evidence. It's often tied to the fluency of processing. If something feels easy to think about, we're more likely to accept it. And because that feeling of ease is internal, it rarely announces itself as mere fluency. It feels like certainty. This becomes more significant when we remember that repetition alone increases fluency. A statement doesn't need to be true to feel familiar. It only needs to be repeated. Over time, repetition reduces cognitive effort, and reduced effort increases acceptance. The mind mistakes familiarity for validity. What makes this particularly unsettling is that we don't experience fluency as a technical cognitive phenomenon. We experience it as intuition. The thought, "this seems right," doesn't come with an attached footnote explaining the judgment was influenced by ease of processing. It simply appears as coherent belief. This is where ease begins to connect to the architecture we established earlier. System 1 is constantly offering interpretations, and when those interpretations are processed fluently, System 2 sees no reason to intervene. The law of least effort ensures that unless something feels off, we won't spend additional energy examining it. In other words, confidence can arise not in depth of reasoning, but from the absence of friction. Once you see that, you begin to notice how often your own agreements or disagreements with an idea correlates not with its substance, but with how effortlessly it entered your mind. However, fluency alone doesn't explain everything. Ease helps ideas feel true, yet there's another mechanism that makes those ideas stick: the mind's tendency to construct coherent stories from whatever information happens to be available. WYSIATI is an acronym for "what you see is all there is." This is Kahneman's phrase for a remarkably persistent tendency of the mind. When constructing a judgment, if cognitive ease explains why certain thoughts feel convincing, What you see as all there is explains why we rarely notice what's missing. System 1 operates on the information that is immediately available, and it does so as if that information were complete. It doesn't pause to ask what evidence might be absent or calculate the probability that crucial data has been left out. It builds the most coherent story it can from what's in front of it, and then presents that story to consciousness with confidence. What's striking is that this isn't a deliberate mistake. The fast system isn't ignoring missing information out of negligence. It simply doesn't represent absence very well. If you're given a short description of a person, your mind immediately begins forming an impression. You don't experience a blank space where statistical context should be. You experience a defined and understandable person, and confidence follows that. The mechanism is subtle. When information fits together smoothly, System 1 treats the story as reliable. The slower system, unless prompted, doesn't step in to question whether the data is incomplete. It evaluates the consistency of the narrative, but not the sufficiency of evidence. This is why first impressions can feel so definitive. A handful of cues is enough to construct a full character assessment. And because the mind values internal consistency over uncertainty, it suppresses ambiguity. Doubt doesn't arise naturally, it has to be summoned. What makes WYSIATI particularly powerful is that it doesn't just affect our judgments about people, it affects our interpretation of events, statistics, political arguments, market trends, anything that can be arranged into a story. If a few data points line up in a way that feels meaningful, the mind closes the case. The fact that countless alternative explanations were never considered doesn't register as a problem. And this connects directly to the law of least effort. If System 1 can produce a coherent narrative quickly, System 2 is unlikely to expend energy searching for missing variables. The mind settles for a story that works, not necessarily a story that's complete. The unsettling implication is that confidence often reflects coherence, not comprehensiveness. We feel certain because the pieces we have fit together, not because we have all the pieces. Once that's clear, another question emerges. If the mind is comfortable building judgments from limited information, how does it respond when confronted with a question it doesn't actually know how to answer? In Lesson 4, Kahneman's answer to that question is both simple and profound. The mind rarely leaves the question unanswered. Instead, it replaces the difficult question with an easier one, answers the easier one, and then proceeds as if it had answered the original. This is what he calls substitution. The process is automatic. There's no moment of conscious exchange where the mind announces, I don't know the answer to this, so I'll switch to something simpler. The substitution happens silently. A question like, how probable is this outcome becomes, how similar is this to what I expect? Or a question like, how happy am I with my life overall becomes, how do I feel right now? The answer that surfaces feels responsive to the original question, even though it was generated by a different one. What makes substitution so effective is that it relies on the architecture we've already seen. System 1 is constantly producing impressions. If the original question demands careful analysis, but a related question can be answered effortlessly, the fast system will supply that answer immediately. Unless System 2 is actively monitoring and intervening, the substitution goes unnoticed. This mechanism helps explain why certain errors are so persistent. When people judge the likelihood that someone belongs to a particular profession based on how closely this description matches a stereotype, they're not deliberately ignoring probability theory. They're answering the easier question of resemblance rather than the harder question of base rates. The substitution feels natural because similarity is easier to evaluate than probability. And because the substitution answer is coherent and fluent, it carries confidence. What's especially revealing is that substitution isn't limited to abstract judgments. It operates in emotional domains as well. If you're asked about your satisfaction with life, and just before answering you've been reminded of a recent dissatisfaction, that emotion may stand in for a broader evaluation. The mind confuses immediacy with representativeness. The mind confuses immediacy with representativeness. In this sense, substitution is not just one heuristic among many, it's the underlying pattern behind several of them. Even aspects of anchoring can be understood as specific causes where an easier attribute replaces a harder one. The mind doesn't like gaps, and it prefers answers to uncertainty. And when the original question is demanding, it quietly reframes it into something manageable. By recognizing substitution, you begin to see it operating everywhere, in snap judgments, in forecasting and political reasoning, even in your own internal debates. The more complex the original question, the more likely an easier surrogate has taken its place. Kahneman explores heuristics in detail, because those heuristics are not isolated quirks. They are structured expressions of this substitutional process. Representativeness begins with something that feels almost harmless: similarity. When we encounter a description of a person, an event, or a situation, the mind instinctively compares it to familiar categories. Without our awareness, it asks, what does this resemble? And from that resemblance, it draws conclusions. The difficulty, as Kahneman shows, is that resemblance is not probability. If a person is described as quiet, analytical, introverted, and detail-oriented, many people instinctively judge them more likely to be a librarian than a salesperson, even if there's more salespeople in the population. The description fits the stereotype. It feels representative. And because it feels representative, it feels probable. Representativeness, as a heuristic, tends to suppress that statistical backdrop. The mind becomes absorbed in the vivid description and neglects the broader context it's in. This isn't a conscious rejection of statistics, it's a structural preference. Evaluating similarities is effortless for System 1. Evaluating base rates, by contrast, requires deliberate reasoning, numerical abstractions, and attention, all of which engage System 2. Unless there's a clear signal to slow down, the fast system's answer is accepted. One of the most revealing demonstrations of representativeness is the conjunction fallacy. When presented with a detailed description of a woman and asked whether they're more likely to be a bank teller or a bank teller active in a feminist movement, many people choose the second option. It seems richer, more consistent with the description, more coherent, yet logically, the probability of two conditions being true together can never exceed the probability of one condition alone. What makes the conjunction seem plausible is narrative coherence. The additional details enhances the story. It increases representativeness, and because coherence feels convincing, the violation of probability goes unnoticed. Representativeness also shapes our perception of randomness. We expect random sequences to look random, to be balanced and patternless. When we see a short sequence of coin flips like heads, 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 tails, tails, it feels less random than heads, tails, heads, tails, tails, heads, even though both are equally likely. The mind expects even small samples to reflect the overall distribution. Kahneman refers to this expectation as a law of small numbers. This reflects a deeper intuition that similarity should persist across scale, an intuition that statistics don't support. What's particularly important is that representativeness doesn't merely distort isolated judgments. It reinforces confidence. When a story's details align with expectation, the mind experiences cognitive ease, and that ease strengthens belief. The problem, then, isn't that the mind uses similarity. Similarity is often useful. The problem is that similarity is treated as a sufficient evidence. The question of probability is quietly replaced with the question of resemblance, and the substitution passes unnoticed. When this clicks, you begin to see how easily vivid descriptions overpower statistical realities. But resemblance is only one shortcut the mind relies on. When we try to estimate how common something is, like how likely a plane crash might be, or how prevalent violent crime is, or how often a particular cause of death occurs, we rarely consult statistics directly. Instead, we rely on how easy examples come to mind. If instances surface quickly and vividly, we infer that the event must be frequent. If they're difficult to recall, we assume they're rare. This substitution happens automatically because recalling examples is far easier than calculating base rates. System 1 searches memory, retrieves what it can, and uses the subjective ease of that retrieval as a proxy for likelihood. The faster the examples appear, the more confident the judgment. What complicates this is that memory is not a neutral archive. It's shaped by emotion, recency, and exposure. Events that are dramatic, frightening, or heavily covered in media are easier to recall, not because they're statistically common, but because they're cognitively vivid. A single widely publicized incident can outweigh thousands of mundane occurrences that leave no mental trace. The result is that perceived risk often diverges sharply from actual risk. If you've recently read about a rare but catastrophic event, your estimate of its probability increases. Not because you've updated your statistical understanding, but because examples now come to mind effortlessly. Kahneman also points out that availability is influenced not only by actual memory, but by the experience of mental effort. In experiments where participants were asked to recall either a small number of assertive behaviors or a large number, those asked to recall more examples often judged themselves less assertive. Not because they lacked evidence, but because generating many examples felt difficult. In this way, availability is less about counting and more about fluency. The mind doesn't ask, how many instances are there? It asks, how easily do they appear? And since the experience of ease feels informative, System 2 sees no reason to correct it. This mechanism becomes particularly powerful in social contexts. When ideas are repeated frequently within a community, they become easier to retrieve. That ease can create what Kahneman calls the availability cascade, where repetition amplifies belief and belief amplifies repetition. Over time, familiarity alone can lead an impression of inevitability. What makes availability so persuasive is that it rarely feels like a shortcut. It feels like intuition. If examples come to mind quickly, it seems reasonable to treat them as evidence. The flaw lies not in consulting memory, but in mistaking the accessibility of memory for the structure of reality. Together, representativeness and availability reveal a consistent pattern. When continued with complexity, the mind substitutes something easier to evaluate. Instead of calculating probabilities, it consults resemblance or recall. And because those substitutions produce coherent answers quickly, they're accepted without much resistance. There's still another mechanism that operates even more quietly, one that shows how arbitrary numbers, even irrelevant ones, can shape our judgments in ways we would strongly deny. Anchoring shows how even irrelevant information can quietly shape our reasoning. When people are asked to estimate a quantity, like the population of a city or the price of a house, their answers are influenced by whatever number they encounter just before making that judgment. This happens even when that number is no logical connection to the question. At first, this mechanism feels implausible. It's easy to accept that stereotypes influence probability judgments, or that vivid memories distort perception. But the idea that a random number could alter an estimate feels harder to accept. And yet, repeated experiments show that it does. In one well-known demonstration, participants spin a wheel rigged to land on either 10 or 65. They're asked then whether the percentage of African countries in the UN is higher or lower than that number, and afterwards to estimate an actual percentage. Those who saw 10 gave lower estimates. Those who saw 65 gave higher ones. The number is clearly random. The influence remains, though. Kahneman suggests that Anchoring operates through adjustment. When confronted with an unfamiliar question, the mind looks for a starting point. If a number is available, even arbitrarily, it becomes that starting point. From there, System 2 attempts to adjust towards what feels reasonable. The difficulty is that these adjustments are usually insufficient and we move away from the anchor, but not far enough because there may be a second mechanism. Exposure to a number activates related associations. A high anchor makes higher values easier to imagine. A low anchor makes lower values feel more plausible. The starting point quietly shapes the direction of thought. What makes anchoring particularly revealing is how resistant people are to acknowledge its influence. Professionals often insist that they're reasoning independently. Real estate agents, for example, may claim that listing prices don't affect their evaluations of a property's value. Yet, higher listing prices systematically raise their estimates. The effect is not a failure of expertise, it's structural. And again, the interaction between the two systems become visible. System 1 provides the starting point effortlessly, and System 2 believes it's correcting that and refining that estimate. Because the process feels deliberate, the final answer feels self-generated. The anchor fades from awareness even though its influence remains embedded in the judgment. Anchoring reveals something important about estimation. We rarely begin from zero. We begin from what's available, and we adjust cautiously from there. Taken together, representativeness, availability, and anchoring show a consistent pattern. When faced with uncertainty, the mind does not remain neutral. It substitutes resemblance for probability, recalls for frequency, and starting points for independent calculations. And because these substitutions operate smoothly, they rarely trigger doubt. There's still another layer to this architecture. Even when we believe we're observing patterns clearly, we often fail to recognize the role of randomness itself. Up to this point, the patterns we've examined have involved substitution. Replacing difficult questions with easier ones, the law of small numbers reveals something slightly different. It shows how uncomfortable the mind is with randomness. Kahneman uses the phrase somewhat ironically. In statistics, the law of large numbers tells us that as sample size increases, averages become more stable and closer to the true population size. Small samples behave differently. They're volatile and they produce extreme outcomes more frequently. Variability is expected, but intuitively, we expect even small samples to resemble the large pattern. If a coin is fair, we expect short sequences of flips to look balanced. If two hospitals provide equal care, we expect similar outcomes across departments. If two investment managers have equal skills, then we expect similar short-term returns. What we resist is the idea that randomness alone can generate streaks, clusters, and apparent trends, especially in small samples. This resistance isn't rooted in ignorance of probability theory. It grows out of representativeness. The mind expects samples to look like the population they come from. A short sequence of coin flips that produce 4 heads in a row feels suspicious, even though it's statistically unremarkable. A small rural hospital with an unusually low cancer rate feels exceptional, even though small populations naturally produce more extreme deviations. Because System 1 is highly sensitive to patterns, it interprets variability as meaningful. When we see a short run of success, we infer skill. When we see a short run of failure, we infer incompetence. The possibility that the pattern is simply noise feels unsatisfying. Kahneman and his collaborators observed this repeatedly in professional settings. In financial markets, fund managers who outperform in a single year are often treated as uniquely talented. Investors assume that short-term performance reflects underlying ability. Yet when performance is examined over longer periods, much of what appears to be skill dissolves into statistical fluctuation. The difficulty is that randomness does not announce itself. It produces outcomes that look structured. And because the mind prefers casual explanations, It fills in reasons after the fact. A streak becomes momentum, a dip becomes mismanagement, and an extreme result becomes a story. The deeper issue is that small samples exaggerate variability, but our intuitions do not scale accordingly. We underestimate how wide the swing can be when data is limited. This connects directly back to the architecture we've been building. System 1 detects patterns effortlessly and it prefers coherence. When confronted with irregular data, it imposes structure. Whereas System 2, unless deliberately engaged, often accepts that structure as meaningful. Recognizing the law of small numbers requires accepting that some of what looks like causation may simply be chance, especially when the sample is small. And once that becomes clear, another statistical reality begins to matter, one that explains why extreme performance often fades over time. If the law of small numbers shows how we overinterpret variability in small samples, regression to the mean explains what often happens after extreme outcomes. Regression to the mean is not a psychological shortcut in the same way that representativeness or availability are. It's a statistical principle. When performance is influenced by both stable factors and random variations, extreme results are likely to be followed by more moderate ones. This happens simply because some portion of the extremeness was due to chance. The difficulty is not understanding the math. The difficulty is that regression feels like causation. Imagine a student who performs exceptionally well on one exam. We tend to attribute that performance to ability, preparation, or effort. If their next score is lower, we look for reasons. Maybe they became complacent. Maybe the test was harder. Conversely, if a student performs poorly and then improves, we may attribute the improvement to discipline or motivation. But statistically, extreme outcomes are often followed by less extreme ones, even if nothing changes. Part of what made the first result extreme was random fluctuation. The regression towards the average is not a correction, it's simply the fading of noise. Kahneman describes how this principle is frequently misunderstood in environments that rely on feedback. In training settings, for example, the instructor sometimes conclude that harsh criticism leads to improvement because poor performers often do better the next time. Yet improvement would likely have occurred regardless, because extremely poor performances are statistically likely to be followed by more typical ones. Likewise, praise may appear ineffective because exceptional performances are often followed by less exceptional ones. What makes regression to the mean psychologically difficult is that it conflicts with our instincts for narrative explanation. When we observe change, we assume intervention caused it. When performance shifts, we look for reasons. Random variation feels incomplete as an answer. This again reflects the structure of System 1. It prefers coherence. It seeks cause and effect. So regression to the mean requires accepting that some change happens without a satisfying story. It asks us to tolerate the idea that improvement or decline may reflect statistical structure rather than motivation, discipline, or skill. And because that explanation is less intuitive than a casual narrative, it rarely demonstrates our interpretation. When we step back and consider the heuristics we've covered, representativeness, availability, anchoring, the law of small numbers, and regression to the mean, a consistent pattern becomes visible. The mind is not poorly designed, it's efficient. It makes rapid inferences on often that are useful, but it's not built to intuit probability, randomness, or statistical stability. It substitutes resemblance, recall, and coherence where numerical reasoning would be required. And because those substitutions feel natural, they rarely trigger skepticism. Understanding this doesn't eliminate these mechanisms, but it clarifies how often our certainty rests on processes that operate quietly and quickly beneath awareness. By this point in the architecture, the pattern is clear. System 1 generates impressions automatically. Cognitive ease strengthens belief. Coherence produces confidence. Randomness is mistaken for structure. Much of what feels like deliberate thought is guided by fast, automatic processes that construct a meaning from what's available. Those processes are efficient and often effective, but they're not designed to intuit probability or randomness. Recognizing that does not weaken judgment, it clarifies it. And that clarity is a foundation for everything.